Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild educational series on how to secure the beginning and ends of seam lines with backstitching. Backstitching is a reinforcement stitch that secures the beginning and end of seams. There are three different ways to secure the beginning and ends of a seam. The first is what is usually taught, called backstitching. It is done by beginning at the cut edge, sewing forward a few stitches, sewing in reverse over those stitches, then sewing forward again. The second type eliminates a few stitches by beginning within the seam line and sewing in reverse, then forward. The third way to secure the seam is by not backstitching at all, but by simply creating smaller stitches from the beginning of the seam for a few stitches, then changing to a regular stitch length to create the sewn seam line. Backstitching is traditionally done by using a normal stitch length and beginning at the cut edge of the fabric, stitching forward 3 to 4 stitches, sewing in reverse back to the beginning over those first stitches, and then sewing forward again over the previous stitches. This type of backstitching is repeated in reverse at the end of the seam. Backstitching at the beginning and ends of a seam locks the threads in place to prevent them from separating. It is done at the beginning and end of the sewn seam line. To backstitch, set the stitch length to 2.5 millimeters. With the presser foot raised, place the cut edge under the presser foot. Hold the thread tails with your left hand and lower the needle just into the edge of the fabric. Then lower the presser foot. If needed, continue to hold the thread tails, sew forward 3 to 4 stitches, keep the needle in the fabric, and press the reverse button. Sew in reverse to the cut edge. Release the reverse button and begin to sew forward over the previous stitching. Continue sewing the seam, guiding the cut edge along the throat plate guide. Sew the seam to the bottom cut edge of the seam allowance. Press the reverse button. Sew in reverse 3 to 4 stitches. Release the button and sew forward to the cut edge. Raise the needle to the highest position, then raise the presser foot. Remove the fabric as instructed in the machine manual. This may be either to the side or toward the back. Cut threads with the machine's thread cutter. As each seam is sewn, trim the remaining thread tail close to the backstitching. The backstitching has been completed. Let's watch how backstitching is done. Match the cut edges of the fabric together. Place the fabric under the raised presser foot and lower the needle into the fabric, holding the thread tails if necessary. Lower the presser foot. Continue to hold the thread tails and sew forward 3 to 4 stitches. Stop with the needle in the fabric. Press the reverse button to sew back to the cut edge. Release the reverse button and sew forward over the first stitching. Sew the seam using the guide on the throat plate to guide the cut edge of the fabric. At the end of the seam, sew to the cut edge. Stop with the needle in the fabric, press the reverse button, and sew back over the last 3 to 4 stitches. Release the reverse button and sew forward to the cut edge. Raise the needle to the highest position, then raise the presser foot. Remove the fabric from under the foot and clip the thread tails close to the backstitching at both ends. The backstitching secures the ends of the seams to prevent them from coming apart. The second type of backstitching eliminates the first step in the previous backstitch method, thereby eliminating a bit of the bulk at the beginning and end of the seam. Basically, this backstitching is created in the same method as the last, except that the stitching is started within the seam allowance and the first stitching is done in reverse to the cut edge and then forward. It is repeated at the end of the seam in reverse. Set the stitch length to 2.5 millimeters. Lower the needle within the seam allowance, holding the thread tails if necessary. Lower the presser foot. Press the reverse button and sew backward to the edge of the fabric. Continue sewing the seam using the throat plate to guide the cut edge. Sew to the other end of the seam allowance, stop with the needle in the fabric, press the reverse button, and sew backward over the last 3 to 4 stitches. Stop sewing, raise the needle to the highest position, then raise the presser foot. Remove the fabric and clip the threads close to the back stitching. One row of those 3 to 4 stitches has been eliminated in the beginning, thereby reducing the bulk at the ends of the seam allowance. The stitches will still remain locked and secure. Let's watch how to do a back stitch while eliminating a few stitches to reduce the bulk. Begin by placing cut edges together. Lower the needle into the fabric away from the top cut edge, but yet within the first 3/8 to 1/2 inch of the seam allowance. Stitch in reverse back to the cut edge. Release the reverse button and sew the seam line. Sew to the end of the seam. Press the reverse button and sew backward a few stitches. Raise the needle, lift the presser foot, remove the fabric, and cut the threads. Some of the bulk is eliminated at the end of the seam line with this method. The third type of stitching to secure the ends of each seam allowance is included in this section because it secures the seam, but it's actually not back stitching, but a couture style of locking the seams to totally eliminate any additional bulk at the ends of each seam. Instead of back stitching of any sort at the beginning and ends of the seam, the stitch length is shortened and the stitching is begun right at the cut edge at the beginning of the seam. The stitching is done with the shortened stitch length for a few stitches, then the stitch length is placed back at a regular stitch length for the sewn seam. At the end of the seam allowance, the stitch is shortened once again to lock the stitches. Begin by shortening the stitch length to 1.5 to 2 millimeters. Holding the thread tails, lower the needle right at the cut edge of the fabric, and then lower the presser foot. Begin stitching with the shortened stitch length, holding the thread tails if necessary. Sew a few stitches to lock the beginning of the seam allowance. Sew for about 3/8 of an inch for a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Stop sewing with the needle in the fabric. Change the stitch length to 2.5 millimeters. Sew the seam using the throat plate to guide the cut edge of the fabric. Approximately 3/8 to a 1/2 inch from the other cut edge, stop sewing with the needle in the fabric. Shorten the stitch length once again to 1.5 to 2 millimeters and sew to the end of the seam. Raise the needle to the highest position, raise the presser foot, and remove the fabric. Clip the threads close to the stitching. Let's watch how to secure the ends of seams without back stitching. Set the stitch length to a short stitch length. Usually between 1.5 to 2 millimeters will be sufficient. Place the cut edges of the fabric together. Lower the needle into the fabric right at the top cut edge of the seam. Stitch forward approximately 3/8 to a 1/2 of an inch, holding the thread tails if necessary. Stop with the needle in the fabric. Change the stitch length to a regular stitch length, which will usually be 2.5 millimeters. Continue sewing the seam. Approximately approximately 1/2 of an inch or so from the cut edge at the bottom of the seam, stop with the needle in the fabric. Shorten the stitch length once again. And then sew to the end of the seam. Raise the needle and lift the presser foot. And of course, trim the excess threads. The shorter stitches will lock the ends of the seam in place. Machines create locked stitches. The shorter stitch length will lock the threads, securing the seam allowance. There are 3 different methods for locking stitches at the beginning and end of seams. 2 of these are backstitch methods, and the third is a couture type technique. Choose the method of backstitching that creates the least amount of bulk for the fabric and project being worked on. Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild video. If you have any questions, email ramona@asg.org. The American Sewing Guild is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to people who believe sewing is a rewarding and creative activity. If you enjoyed this video, join ASG to view our library of in-depth educational videos on various sewing topics. They are free to our members. Members also enjoy discounts from vendors who support our organization, along with many other benefits.